Doing nothing is sometimes doing something, because the act of stopping them could have changed everything. Thank you for clicking on this video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today we are going to be talking about Ray and Faye Copeland. Now these two are basically the images of deception. No one would ever believe that these two sweet elderly people could do anything bad, but these are the faces of serial killers. By the way, I'm doing Suspect Summer all summer long if you didn't know, and I would love your support by thumbsing up or subscribing or commenting something down below to let me know you enjoy these. Now let's get back to the story. So let's rewind a bit. Ray Copeland was born December 30th, 1914 in Oklahoma to Jess and Laney Copeland. They never really had a secure home. They moved around an awful lot, and when they finally did settle down, he had two younger siblings, a younger sister and a younger brother. They lived in Ozark Hills in Arkansas, and this was not really a good time either because it was the time of the Great Depression. And Ray actually had to drop out of school to help with the family farm. So Ray had to drop out of school, but he was still quite spoiled, and anything that he demanded, he got. Now let's rewind a little bit more, and at 26 years old, Ray went into a local doctor's office to have a routine checkup, and there he met Faye Della Wilson. She was born August 4th, 1921, and she was 19 at the time they met. She was the daughter of Rufus and Gladys Wilson, and she actually had 6 siblings. They had pretty much stayed in one little dirt floor house their entire lives, but Faye and Ray fell in love instantly, and 6 months later they were actually married. A year later, they had their first son, Everett, and 2 years later, they had their next son, Billy Ray. In 1944, they decided to move to Fresno County, California, and that's where they had 3 more children. Their only girl, Betty Lou, came next, then Alvia, and then William Wayne. They moved around quite a bit, which I will get into the reasons why in a little bit. In 1966, they actually moved to Missouri, where they bought a 40-acre farm. It was around Chillicothe, and Faye actually took a job at the local gloves making shop. And 23 years later, the Crime Stoppers actually got a call on August 20th, 1989 at 7:30 p.m. It was from an anonymous tipper who said that Ray Copeland had been murdering his farm hands, and there were bones and skulls in his property. Now Ray and Faye were elderly now, but Ray had had a long record with the police. So in October, they decided to go over there and check it out. Now what they did to kind of throw him off the trail of what they were doing was they had a few of the detectives go in and basically ask him questions about his previous allegations, and the rest were out with a search warrant and bloodhounds searching his property for the bones. At first they weren't finding anything, but then once they dug a little bit deeper, they found 3 bodies of men in a nearby barn. And then after that, they found 2 more bodies, all of which basically had the same MO. They were killed the same way, and were all in shallow graves except for one who was in a well. The autopsy determined that they had all been killed the same way, execution style, shot once in the back of the head with a .22 caliber Marlin rifle. That same kind of gun was found in Ray and Faye's home. A register was also found listing the names of their farmhands, 12 of which had X's next to their name, and 5 of those with X's were determined to be the bodies that were found. They were actually identified by their dental records because they were so badly decomposed that they couldn't tell who they were. They were identified as Dennis K. Murphy, Wayne Warner, Jimmy Dale Harvey, John W. Freeman, and Paul J. Cowart. The gun was sent in for a ballistics test and came back with a match to the wounds that were found on the bodies. But as we all know, some serial killers keep trophies from their victims, and Ray and Faye were no different. But they were older, which makes what the police found even creepier. They actually found a blanket, a quilt, made out of the clothes of their victims. So the Copelands were easily and quickly charged with these murders, but the investigation began to dig up more evidence before the trial began. Because the question really was, why would they do this? And how? Because they weren't young. I mean, Ray had quite the history of a criminal record. Starting when he was 20, he actually stole 2 hogs from his family and went and sold them in another town to make money for himself. His father actually knew about that but never filed charges. I mean, he stole lots of livestock through his 20s and then moved on to bigger crimes while simultaneously still stealing livestock. He was arrested when he was 22 in 1936 for forging government checks. He was jailed for a year for that, and when he got out, that is when he met Faye. When they moved away to California, Ray was accused of stealing horses of one of the neighbors. Although charges were never filed, the reputation in the town was damaged for the Copeland family, so that is when they had to move back to Arkansas. Less than a month of being back there, he was already arrested for theft of cattle and jailed for 1 year. After he got out, they had to move yet again to Rocky Comfort, Missouri, and then he was arrested once again for, you guessed it, cattle theft. He wasn't even jailed, he was just sentenced to manual labor at the judge's farm. In 1953, they began traveling all around just like Ray's parents had done, forging checks, getting away with it, and 13 years later, that's when they settled down in Missouri and bought their farm. This was in a different town than they had stayed in previously. Although people didn't know Ray and he hadn't even gotten in trouble yet, the neighbors didn't like him, saying that he was a bitter elderly man and that they thought that he abused his family. His wife and children denied that at first though, but eventually it came out that he was really strict and pretty aggressive with them at all times. Their large family needed money though, and even with Faye's job, it just wasn't cutting it. But Ray, all he knew how to do was steal and manipulate people, and so he had to come up with another plan because he knew if he continued to do that and get caught, it would be a much bigger sentence. So instead, he needed to come up with the biggest scam of all. It wasn't brilliant or original in any way, but somehow it worked. He had farm workers at the farm that he would have go to cattle auctions with other people who were hitchhikers or drifters. He would have them write a check and give it to the sellers and then take the cattle back to the farm. He knew that their checks would bounce for that amount of money, but by that time that the police could come or that anyone could notice, the cattle would already be sold. Ray would sell it and get the money. And since the buyers were mostly hitchhikers, the police knew that they were probably already out of town. Some were actually traced back to working with him, and then he just told the police that he was also scammed too, and he didn't know anything about their scamming until it happened to him. And since these farm workers skipped town, the police believed Ray. He did this dozens of times until a man named Gerald Perkins was actually interrogated, and he was one of Ray's victims, so he told them all about Ray's scheme, and they went and arrested him for check forgery and sentenced him to 2 years. But those 2 years actually gave him time to work on his scamming and make it even better. He decided instead of having his workers write checks from their own accounts, he would have them open up a post office box and an account to write checks from where they would sign. The accounts didn't have their names on them at all, and when the buyers would ask why, they would just say because the auctioneers didn't like them, so if they had their name, then there wouldn't be a fair shake. So once they wrote the check, got the cattle, they went and closed that account, sold the cattle, and then the seller's check would bounce and there was nothing they could do about it. After the scheme went exactly as planned, the farm workers would go back to the farm with Ray, and supposedly that is where Ray and Faye Copeland decided to murder the key witness that could ruin everything for them, their farmhand. They would murder them right there on the farm and bury them there as well. Now, Ray hired many homeless people because they would work well and for cheap. He gave them $50 a day, room and board, everything seemed great, and all they had to do was basically scam these cattle sellers. But once they actually got the cattle and were back at the farm, they found themselves with a gun pointed at their head. One of those was a 57-year-old named Jack McCormick, who had went and scammed for cattle and then went back to the farm, and he was really close to Ray, and when he turned around, there was a gun to his head, and he basically pleaded with him, saying that he wouldn't say anything and to just let him go, and for some reason Ray let him. So Jack got away, and it took him 5 months, but 5 months later he called the police and was the anonymous tip caller that called in and exposed everything. It took him 5 months because he was so scared that Ray would come back and try to kill him. It was so obvious with Ray's past that he murdered for money, but with Faye, they weren't so sure. And with 7 bodies still missing, they made a deal with Faye, basically. If she gave up the locations of all of the bodies, then she would only be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. That would only put her in jail for a few months instead of death penalty like she was looking at. But she looked them dead in the face and said she knew nothing of the murders and stuck completely to her story. Ray, on the other hand, was profusely trying to plead insanity, and it wasn't working. There was a very slim chance that it would, and once he knew that it wasn't, then he tried another plan. He tried to make a plea agreement, but they refused to give him any, not the same one his wife got, not any at all. It was November 1st of 1990, and this was the beginning of Faye Copeland's trial. They were both tried separately. Faye was 69 at the time of her trial, and she continued to stick to the fact that she knew nothing of these murders or if her husband was involved. Her defense tried to portray her as a wife with many children, and she was basically abused by Ray the entire time they were married and suffered from battered woman syndrome, which nobody really doubted, but they also didn't doubt that she was involved. The evidence against her was enough, including the handwriting that was hers on the register with the X's next to it. That handwriting was compared to a letter she wrote Ray while they were both in prison, and it was a match. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection for 4 of the murders and a life sentence for the 5th. On March 7th of the next year, it was time for Ray Copeland's trial, and he was pretty easily convicted of murder of all 5 victims and sentenced to death by lethal injection just like his wife. When he heard that his wife had gotten the same sentence as him, all he said was, well, these things happen to some, you know, which is a very weird, not empathetic at all thing to say. But this next part shocked me more than anything, and that is because neither of these sentences would actually be lived out. 2 years after Ray was convicted, he was in the Potosi Correctional Facility where he died of natural causes before he could be put to death. It was October 19th, 1993, and his body was then cremated. 6 years after that, Faye, who had not been yet executed, actually got her sentence overturned on August 6th of 1999. They said that the evidence of her involvement actually wasn't enough to have such a harsh sentence. She actually had appealed before that, saying that the jury didn't get to hear the evidence that her husband had abused her the whole time they were together. And Judge Orty Smith listened. Faye was to remain in prison for her 5 consecutive life sentences, but some of the women's groups in the area were not very happy about that. The women's rights activist group said that she was no longer a threat to society and she should be let out. In 2000, there was actually an attempt to reinstate her death penalty. And that was when the Missourians Against State Killings, or the MASK organization, came forward in support of Faye, telling people to send her letters supporting her and saying that she should be allowed out. And a petition was also being organized by Governor Roger Wilson at the time, but what ultimately got her out was a stroke. It was August 10th of 2002, and she had a stroke that left her completely incapable of speaking, and she was also partially paralyzed. She was paroled weeks later, and she was sent to the Morningside nursing home in her hometown of Harrison, Arkansas. She passed away about a year later at 82 years old on December 30th of 2003. She said about Ray, "I begged him time and time again to please stay out of trouble. We had our home and everything paid for. We were on Social Security, so why would he turn around and mess all of that up just like he has?" She also said that she learned very early on that when you marry someone, you stick with them, and so the husband was the boss in her eyes, and that was Ray, no matter how awful he was to her. They left behind 5 children, 17 grandchildren, and became the oldest couple to ever be sentenced to death in America. So do you think Faye was involved with these murders, or do you think she was just as physically and mentally tortured as the victims? Or was it both? Was she helping him because she thought she had to, or was she helping him because she enjoyed doing it too? There are so many questions still to this case, and that's why I don't mind doing solved cases like this, because there is still so much mystery to it, and that is what I enjoy about these videos. If you don't look at them as such a true thing that pulls at your heartstrings for these victims, the mystery is what intrigues me. I feel like so many of these solved cases still won't ever be fully solved. There's always at least one question that goes unanswered. So you leave me down below. Do you think Faye was involved? How do you think an elderly man did this for so long? And anything else you can think of about this case down below. Serial killers are the weirdest and most intriguing to talk about, so leave me more down below you want me to speak about. And by the way, thank you so much for subscribing. I'm getting more and more traffic in on these videos, and I really appreciate that you like these and continue to come back. Please make sure to thumbs up if you do like it to let me know. And I want to remind you, with such dark content, that you are powerful enough to become the darkness or brighten it. I love you, and I'll let you go. Bye. But sometimes we are frozen in the face of fear that next they'll get rid of us.